Hello, welcome back to the NOTCAST. It's episode 287 today, and that means it's 5th of May 2023. I've been doing about 100 of these a year, which is a big number. I try not to think about it being a big number. It's like 2 a week, which is not actually that much if you think about it. But then at the same point, I kind of realised I've been doing this for almost 3 years. Obviously started in the middle of COVID. Well, actually the early days of COVID when we were only 7 months in. And COVID has today been declassified by the World Health Organization as an emergency. So therefore, officially, COVID is no longer a thing. Although we all know it really is a thing and it's still out there and it still exists. Hang on. But we all know COVID really still exists. And if you have any friends that work in the health service or in hospitals or anything like that, they'll agree with you that it's still out there. It's just perhaps been declassified by the WHO after 3 years. And what a long 3 years it's been. Obviously doing a NOTCAST every 3 days, 2 a week, has got me up to 300 episodes. And I started this at the time when I wasn't sure if I was going to see my friends again. Or often, or how long it was going to last, or if even I was going to make it through all of this thing. And then here we are. I guess officially we've survived. Although, of course, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who will survive and what will be left of them? Today, I am talking about, as I have been talking about on many previous episodes, records that are in my record collection. Not, by the way, always my favourite records. And this one I'm talking about today, I have some harsh words for. Hopefully you will forgive me. This record is, depending on your point of view, either the 5th or the 7th or the 10th album by British band who has also had only one sole member, the and their covers record released in 1995. The record is Hanky Panky, and also the soundtrack to the film Judge Dredd, which they contributed a song to. The single I Saw the Light, and the Solitude EP, and the official bootleg at the same point. So I think I'll start off with the pretty obvious kind of point, which is that it's a covers album, and it's a covers album of songs by Hank Williams. And I am not a fan of covers albums. As I've mentioned before, very few covers albums to me actually feel like they're any good. Covers albums like The Spaghetti Incident and Garage Incorporated really do feel like just an excuse to push product out there, really, to make sure that they've got another record that's on the shelves to sell copies to go alongside a tour. Pin-Ups by Bowie is my least favourite Bowie record. It's worse even than Tonight and Never Let Me Down Again. Oh, I'm going to have to open the door because here I have somebody who wants to come in and see us. At some point, we may get interrupted by a little black friend, and we may not, depending on his point of view. He stopped squealing, or stopped asking now that I've opened the door. It's absolutely typical, isn't it? There's another door, which is closed. I presume that's the one he wants me to open, because when cats bond with a human, come in and see me. Come on, darling, come on. When cats bond with a human, they get quite traumatized if they're not able to go and spend time with and hang around with the humans that they feel bonded to. This little fella, who's now up on the table over there, presumably feels bonded to me. Or on the other hand, he just sees me as staff, and maybe that's how it works. So let's pick up the varied history behind this particular record, which was released in 1995. Now, I said it's either the 5th or the 7th or the 10th album, depending on your point of view. There was the Spirits cassette, which was hand duplicated by Matt Johnson, and I think was in very limited numbers. I don't know if any copies still exist. There was a See Without Being Seen, which was issued again as a hand duplicated cassette in 1979, and then later pressed as a cassette and CD in the year 2020. We had Burning Blue Soul, the first solo album by Matt Johnson, which then later on became the record. Pornography of Despair, which was a B-side, which is an album that then later became a set of B-sides. This is The Cat. And then we had Soul Mining, which was obviously the first debut the record released in 1983. Infected, Mind Bomb, Dusk, and then in 1994 the compilation album released only in America on CD, Solitude, which I mentioned previously. This was the first time where there appeared to be looking backwards as opposed to looking forwards. This being an album which concluded the 2 re-recordings which went onto the Disinfected EP, a new heavy rock version of the title track Infected, and a stripped down, kind of stripped back version of This Is the Day called That Was the Day. This Is the Day, of course, features in the upcoming motion picture Guardians of the Galaxy Part 3, and it has a major role in that, but that's probably why I've chosen to do it today. But actually, the reason why I choose to do a NOTCAST is because my brain kind of focuses on ideas, and I kind of fixate on something to the exclusion of everything else. And right now I've been thinking about the Hanky Panky album, and as I've mentioned before, with cover versions albums, I am not a fan. So there were 2 releases, sort of simultaneous-ish. I'm going to address the good part to start with, and the not so good part afterwards. The first kind of song, or the first release of 1995, at least I think this was the first release, I could be slightly wrong, is this, the soundtrack to Judge Dredd, the absolutely awful 1995 Sylvester Stallone film. And for some reason, this film felt the need to include in the cast Rob Schneider, whoever that guy is, to be the absurd and frankly annoying comic foil to Sylvester Stallone, who should have spent most of the film with his helmet on, saying, "I am the law." But he didn't. He spent most of the film with the helmet off, saying, "I am not the law," and made the film much, much worse. This is a terrible film. The soundtrack album is better for 2 reasons, and the 2 reasons both start with the. They are The Cure and the in big letters. Clearly they thought those 2 bands were a bigger draw than they actually were. The track is the last vocal track between 1993 and the year 2000, the only vocal original by the released in 7 years. And the track is Darkness Falls, and I think it's a very, very good song. There's nothing about it which feels in any way less than absolutely top-notch. If you haven't heard Darkness Falls, I would suggest go to YouTube, type it into the machine, have a listen to it. It's a stunning, well, I think stunning is probably the right word, very kind of dark, dense kind of track, completely in tune with everything that was happening around about the time of Dusk. On my playlist of Dusk, I've included Darkness Falls near the end of side 2, and it just slots in absolutely perfectly, like a fantastic LP track. So Darkness Falls by the from Judge Dredd. This is going to be good. There was no indication that we were about to face a creative desert. There was no indication that the next album was going to be, apart from the fact that you've heard vaguely about it, was going to be an album of cover versions. And the album after that was going to be 5 years in the making. Later on in 1995, although I could be slightly wrong with the chronology, saw the release of the single I Saw the Light by the. And this, hang on a second. As you can tell, I do these in one take. It came as a CD single and as a 10-inch. This features 4 tracks on a 10-inch single, which actually, by the way, is a lovely piece of design. This feels very much like, if you think about the old-fashioned stuff that was made in the 30s, used to come in covers like this, kind of like big, thick, brown dust jackets with just text on and just a lyric or just a, information on there. The idea of, a photograph was not really a thing at the time. So when Hank Williams was making his original recordings, which I think was in the 1920s and 1930s, that stuff, that's how things were packaged and presented in those days. Our album was originally a collection of several double-sided single-song discs. It was like 5 10-inch discs which ran at 78 RPM. So it was like a photo album. Each side was a separate song. That's a concept which has been repeated for a number of albums, including Metallica's Death Magnetic box set, is the idea that every song on the album gets a separate side of vinyl. But for me, at least, the album which came afterwards Hanky Panky, this is my least favourite The album by a long stretch, and I'll tell you why. I think cover version albums are almost without exception really very bad indeed. Now, a great cover version sounds like it's a song that happens to have been written by somebody else that belongs to the band. So you think about Pet Shop Boys doing Always on My Mind. That feels like it's a Pet Shop Boys song that happens to have been written by somebody else. Johnny Cash's Hurt is a Johnny Cash song that happened to be written by Trent Reznor. The songs that are on Bowie's Pinups, Metallica's Garage Incorporated, Guns N' Roses' Spaghetti Incident just feel like B-sides taken from their record collection. They don't feel like songs that belong to the band. And the songs on Hanky Panky don't feel like the songs at all. They feel like the songs performed by but they don't feel like they've been written by Matt Johnson. They don't feel like they belong in the character of the. Now, if you were going to say that this album was, for example, the next studio album with new original Matt Johnson original compositions, you sit there and go, he's been listening to a lot of blues, hasn't he? You remember the character that we have in an artist, and you identify an artist with a set number of kind of parameters. So, for example, the Fields of the Nephilim, it's fast, it's heavy, it sounds like it's a really weird version of the Cookie Monster on vocals. I love the Fields of the Nephilim, by the way. Metallica, it's like prog thrash, and Nine Inch Nails, and obviously you reduce like a band down to its almost its parody elements like Spitting Image, but you think about and you think about what makes a great the song, and there's a bit of incisive social commentary, there's some emotional stuff that's in there, there's a slightly adventurous kind of instrumentation, there's lyrics which are around Britain and America and politics and your place in the world. Hanky Panky has none of that at all. And all the lyrics are focused upon a very limited, very small set of subject matters. So even the titles that we've got on here, such as If You'll Be a Baby to Me, Your Cheating Heart, There's a Tear in My Beer, I Can't Escape From You. Those aren't song titles that you would think would sit on a the studio record. The lyrics are the way in which language is constructed, the way in which the imagery is built, the way in which the melodies are constructed. They don't sound like the songs. It sounds like it sounds like they're are covering somebody else, which obviously exactly what it is. Whereas great cover version albums sound like, here are 12 songs written by the band that I didn't know existed. They just happen to have been written by somebody else. And then you kind of go, right, now that makes an amazing cover version. So think of the best cover versions of all time. For example, as I've said, Pet Shop Boys Always on My Mind. Manic Street Preachers were always good at a cover version. I particularly like their version of Camper Van Beethoven's Take the Skinheads Bowling, for example. And you think about some of the U2 cover versions are actually really good. Some of the Metallica ones, Free Speech for the Dumb, for example, is a good one. Some of them not great. With this, though, it doesn't feel like it's an album of the original songs. It doesn't sound like a the record to me. It sounds like the have been forced to release an album as a contractual obligation, and they've quickly kind of looked in their record collections and went, Hank Williams is pretty good, we'll do an album of Hank Williams covers. Whereas when Flaming Lips did Dark Side of the Moon, or they did, I think it's Sgt. Pepper's, I think they did with the Little Help with My Friends album, it feels like those are Flaming Lips songs, that they've become Flaming Lips songs by the way in which Flaming Lips have approached them and recorded them, and the lyrics to some of those songs you could imagine could be Flaming Lips originals. Not the case with Hanky Panky at all. This album captured or perhaps coincided with a couple of other major events. Matt moved to the US. He'd been listening a lot to Howlin' Wolf and John Lee Hooker and other blues artists such as Robert Johnston and obviously Hank Williams. He tried to go for a simplified songwriting approach. He'd spent some time in Mallorca with DC Collard working through some new songs, which didn't turn out to be. He'd brought on a new guitarist, Eric Schmierhorn. Eric, I think, had been in the touring version of the band in 1993. Eric being formerly of Tin Machine and Iggy Pop as well. So obviously somebody who was used to working with vocalists with a pretty clear vision around what they wanted to achieve. And most of this was, I think, recorded at a place called the War Room, with Pro Tools and tape loops and things like that. But they were writing new music to old lyrics and old melodies to try and make the songs feel a little bit more like they were the songs. But listening to them, and I just kind of felt these don't feel like the songs in the way in which something like Love Is Stronger Than Death or Infected or Uncertain Smile or The Sinking Feeling felt like the songs. These felt like somebody was trying to write a simulacra or simulation of songs from that era, as opposed to writing their own genuine artistic material, their own genuine artistic statements. And yeah, I don't like this album at all. As you've already worked out, it feels like the B-sides with no A-side. There's an element of, when you do the best cover versions, of working on existing material and then putting your strengths into things like arrangements. So, though you probably don't know this, I'm a huge fan of the Anchoress, who has recently released a series of cover version EPs. And those EPs are fabulous because they feel like Anchoress songs that happen to have been written by other people. And when you're listening to something like Bizarre Love Triangle or This Is Yesterday, for example, I don't get a sense that I'm listening to somebody else's song or I'm listening to a cover version. It feels like I'm listening to one of her songs that happened to have been written by somebody else. Whereas with this album, I don't feel that at all. It feels like there's an element of acting, or there's an element of inhabiting a role and performing a play, as opposed to I believe in these songs. There's also an element of place marking around this. It's kind of like, well, if you haven't got any juice creatively, if you haven't got any new songs, if you've got creative constipation, if you've got a lack of songs in the bank, you end up kind of going, well, I'm going to do a cover versions album to buy myself some time. It's a placeholder. There's an element of exploring the voice, exploring the arrangements. But if there's no new tour to justify the album, and there's no new songs to justify any releases, then the question is, why? Because if there's been no previous covers in the body of work, and I don't think there were at this point, it was inexplicable that the band would suddenly make one of their major artistic statements to be an album of cover versions, all cover versions of one guy, not backed up with a tour, not backed up with any major profile in the way in which previous episodes. So I was kind of sat there just going, what is the point of this record? It really feels like somebody had taken a bunch of B-sides and put them onto an album and went, that'll satisfy your album obligations under your contracts, your super mega global mega national company. It just, I don't like it at all. And there were no live shows, just promotional radio and TV appearances. You know, this came out on the 25th of February 1995, pretty much as Britpop was in the ascendant. The bands that were big and popular, Blur, Suede, Oasis, Menswear for God's sake, Pulp, you know, were all bands that were were a band out of time. They'd gone deep into Americana at a time when the rest of the world had gone in a completely different direction. And it charted very low. I think it charted at 28 in the UK charts. And to be honest, that's a very healthy chart position for a band that's not touring and not got any original songs whatsoever. It really felt like a pointless album release. The sales, I think, were pretty poor. It was felt like the band had been cut loose a little bit from the corporate machine. I think this was the last one that was released under the band's contract with Sony. And this was the start of the wilderness years for the group. We were living in a grey, dull, conservative Britain. The only thing that was exciting were our record collections and our pop stars. You know, the weather was bad, the economy was bad, everything looked pretty bleak out there. New Order had split up, Depeche Mode had half died, The Cure were shedding members left, right and centre, U2 had started to disappear, The Other came back with an album of cover versions. Matt Johnson was 34, and to me this album feels like a midlife crisis. I had a midlife crisis, and that's a moment where you suddenly look at your life and you realize, well, time is running out. You know, the sands of time are running low. You don't get a second chance to be 34 again. What are you going to do with that time? What decisions are you going to make? You know, are you going to commit to this life, or are you going to change it? Because if you're going to change it, you're running out of time and opportunities to do so. You don't get a second chance around that. The other had been popular and working at a relatively high profile for probably around about 10 to 12 years. There was an element of a changing of the guard in terms of music and culture. So the other are now starting to move, like their then contemporaries, The Cure, Depeche, New Order, etc. Were bands that were starting to move into legacy positions, bands that had a lot of history. And so therefore, when a band has a lot of history, you then start to think about, well, the people that come to see the shows, the people that go and buy the records, are they buying the records and coming to see the shows because of what the band are doing now, or because they want to be reminded of what the band had done previously? This is a battle that every band has. Some bands fight and rage against the dying of the lights by constantly putting out new stuff and only touring when there's new stuff and not recognizing the fact that they are a product of their history. Whereas for me, for this period of time, it was almost as if they were going, well, actually, we've got nothing else to say. And sometimes, and this is why I get very frustrated about cover versions albums, is that it's the sound of a band that doesn't necessarily have something to say, but needs to say something. Very much like this YouTube series, which I'm doing, depending on how charitable you want to be about it. And I don't like cover versions albums. I've never liked cover versions albums. From a creative perspective, I don't understand how you can get to the position where you can't write songs anymore. You know, I mean, from a creative position, I write probably 25 songs a year. It's not hard to do. Now, some of those songs are not great, and I don't share them with anybody, but it's not hard to write a new song. It really isn't, at least for me. Now, 10 good ones, that's a little bit harder, but new material is not difficult. It's not difficult to make. There's always something to be interested and excited about. And yet for me, this is the sound of somebody going, I've got no creative impulse anymore. There's an element of procrastination about that. There's an element of thinking about, I need to do something, but without actually having an artistic statement to make. And so for me, Hanky Panky is the worst the record which has come out. And by the way, I am including the instrumental soundtrack albums released at a prolific rate since 2011. And the records, I mean, even on here on the albums which have been released, it states Gunsluts coming soon. By the way, it never came out. If the definition of coming soon is now, Gunsluts still hasn't had a release, and it's 28 years after they told you it was coming soon. And whilst it was recorded live and mixed manually at the War Room and mastered by Harry Weinberg, and there's Hank Williams looking emaciated in what looks like a jail. What you end up is 11 songs, 33 minutes, quite short songs, very minimal arrangement and production. You do have some slightly interesting kind of players on here, as I've said, Eric Schmearhorn from Tin Machine and Iggy Pop, DC Collard, who'd been part of the live band since 1989, and you have Galan Dorsey there on bass, who you will also have seen in David Bowie's band between 1995 and 2013, doing an absolutely incredible. Also, by the way, Galan Dorsey has an incredible voice, and the idea that someone with a voice that good doesn't actually sing on the album is a little weird. And then you end up, the lyrics are I don't think they're particularly good. So the single I Saw the Light is quite good. That's the only thing on it that's worthwhile, really. It's the only one that I think I've seen the band play live. I think I saw them play it live in 2000 on the Naked Self tour. But then I think I saw them play Weary Blues from Waiting, actually, as the last song on the first time that I saw them at the London Garage in January 2000. But you end up with lyrics that are very straightforward, very conventional, very one-dimensional, and they're all about, well, having your heart broken by an evil woman. And I end up just kind of going, it's not it's not what I want from the other album, and it doesn't speak to me. So the other records which came out, Soul Mining Infected, Mind Bomb, Dusk, to me, and I've said this before, music was the map when I was lost, and those records spoke to me and helped me to make sense of the world and the life that I was living. There was nothing in Hanky Panky that I was able to go, I have seen the light. I'm able to approach a new situation from a different angle. I feel like I've learned something. I feel like I've grown in some way. There just wasn't any of that in Hanky Panky at all. Hanky Panky felt pointless, and it, to be honest, it felt like a waste of money and time. I'm kind of putting it on, and I listened to it several times, and I'm like, does it get any better? No, it didn't speak to me. I didn't. What I want from my music is music that helps me live the life that I'm living and makes the life that I'm living make more sense. And Hanky Panky didn't do any of that. So it's my least favourite of their album. And Whilst Darkness Falls is a great song, it's a Matt Johnson original. It's not a Hank Williams song. The Hank Williams songs don't work. There was the single, I Saw the Light, which was backed with 3 cover versions. These times only songs that would have been performed by Hank Williams, not Hank Williams songs themselves. I'm Free at Last, Someday You'll Call My Name, and There's No Room in My Heart for the Blues. I didn't have anything in common with blues music at all, and I still don't. I don't understand it. I don't see it. I can't grasp it. There's nothing about the blues that speaks to me in any way, and I'm just kind of sat there just going, what's it about? It's about, a guy that works on a farm, and if you play it backwards, his dog comes back and his wife doesn't leave him. What? I just don't get the blues at all. It's not relevant to my life. And all the music which I love and all the music which I listen to speaks to me about my life. Or speaks to me about the life that people are living. And there's nothing in here that does that. And at the same point, all the lyrics are around heartbreak and despair, being cheated on and having your heart broken by a woman, an evil devil woman, as Cliff Richard sang, later on the Suedes sang in 1999. And it just felt to me that the well was dry. And if you're going to do a cover version album, make it a bunch of songs from different artists that feel like they belong to you. So if you're going to do a covers versions album, and I have no problem with the concept of cover version albums, but it's got to sound like songs that happen to be owned by the band that were written by other people. So Guns N' Roses, Spaghetti Incident, as I've said before, my least favourite Guns album. Pin-Ups, my least favourite Bowie album. Garage Incorporated, or whatever it's called, my least favourite Metallica album. Even lower than Reload. All the cover version albums, to me, with very few exceptions, the Flaming Lips ones particularly are particularly good. All the cover version albums I have are B-sides in search of an A-side. They're songs that shouldn't be a cover. They shouldn't be an album, because I listen to them and I go, they don't feel like they're songs that were written by the people that are singing them. And truthiness is really, really important in art. I've got to believe that the artist relates to these songs. Now you're choosing cover versions because obviously they mean something to you, but unless you very recently had your heart broken by an American woman and you live in a dust bowl and work on a farm, the songs in Hanky Panky have very limited scope and appeal. They really, really do. And by the way, it did say that this would be the first of an occasional series of cover versions albums. There have been no cover version albums that have been released since. So don't trust what the band tell you. There is a couple of things that the band did after this. I think they used the Hanky Panky album as a way of trying to find a way into recording with a new lineup, as a way of bleeding a new lineup in and blooding that lineup and getting them to the point where they're able to perform again. They moved to a studio called Sear Sound in New York in 1997 and recorded a lot of instrumental tracks under the name Gunsluts, for the Gunsluts album, featuring a slightly different lineup. We had the former Kenny Rogers bassist Spencer had joined at this point, and Earl Harvin, one of the best drummers in the world, was playing drums as well as, and Eric Schmierhorn was in the band. But it was a very American band, and it sounded very American. But Matt was struggling to write lyrics. He was approaching the instrumentals on Gunslots as almost his version of Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music. And there's only 3 songs which I think have been released from the Gunslots period, apart from the official bootleg, which I will mention in the next episode about and those are Diesel Breeze, which appeared on Naked Self, Gunslots itself, which was a 1-track CD in the year 2000, and a track called Psychic Sauna that was released as part of the download series. Those songs were dark, they were swampy, they were uncommercial, they didn't have conventional verse, chorus, verse approaches, and it was leaning into the start of Matt's kind of work with instrumentals. He re-recorded several of the Gunslots tracks to try and make them more commercially accessible, but they were rejected by Sony. And Hanky Panky is the end of the major label period, to the point where I think it became increasingly apparent that there was a frisson and a friction between Matt and the label, which is why we don't have any, we have one expanded edition of an album which just features alternate mixes on, which have all been released anyway elsewhere. But this is why we don't have multi-disc versions of things like Soul Mining or Infected or Mind Bomb with the relevant DVDs, with the relevant B-sides, with relevant live material, alternate mixes, because I think the relationship has become very strained between the two parties. We instead have to think about bonus material being released as official bootlegs through the band's own website. This is official bootleg number 6. This was recorded during rehearsals in early 1995 in Holland for the Hanky Panky promotional tour. And this features, a total of 13 tracks, although only 7 or 8 musical performances. So versions of I Saw the Light, My Cheating Heart, Dogs of Lust, Weary Blues from Waiting, and 6 More Miles are on here alongside some studio chats. They're excellent recordings. They're well worth hearing, but they are curiosities. And in a different world, these would be alternate versions that appear on a second CD of the Hanky Panky album, which hasn't come out for boring record company politics reasons. The 5 years after this were a Spartan time to be a The fan. There was very little information and even less music that was released. There was, I think, no actual material released between 1995 and the year 2000. There were a small number of live shows at the end of 1999, but that was it. And it felt to me at a certain point that maybe The were done, and Hanky Panky was the last album that was a contractual obligation to make sure that he wasn't sued out of existence by a hostile record company. Certainly that's how it felt in about 1998. Although whilst we were used to The disappearing for years on end, it felt different this time. It felt like The had gone and maybe weren't coming back. And it's a strange place to be. But obviously, at the same point, the other bands from the era, from the late 80s, early 90s, were falling like flies. And it felt like everything had changed over and nothing was the same again. So Hanky Panky is probably it absolutely is my least favourite The album. I can't connect to the songs. I don't find anything in the songs that I feel compelling or worthy of revisiting on a regular basis. It felt like a statement made out of necessity. Sorry, I had a cough there. If Hanky Panky feels like a statement made out of necessity, a statement made for contractual reasons, because of creative constipation, and it feels like an album that doesn't need to exist. It feels like a B-sides compilation. I don't like it at all. If you do, that's absolutely great. That makes one of you. But to me, it was very, very disappointing, and I've really struggled to remain a The fan after its release. And then, of course, we had what happened next, which is the album Naked Self, the year 2000, and some extra wilderness years that came as a result of that. So that's a less than positive review of The's album. My life at the time 1995. So I was 21 when this came out. As a 21-year-old who was in his first mature adult relationship. And yeah, I'd been cheated on in the previous one before that, by the way, in quite an obvious and painful way. You would have thought I could have revisited the 17-year-old version of me that had been treated disrespectfully in a previous relationship, and went, well, yeah, I can see the whole point of your cheating heart, and there's a tear in my beer, and I'm a long gone daddy, and honky tonking and all that stuff. But at the point this album came out, where this album was and where I were two very, very different places. I wasn't interested in revisiting 75-year-old arcane Americana country music about infidelity from country and western. Country and western was like, both types of music, but not for me. And so I struggled to like this album, and in the end I gave up. I don't like it. There is a lot better stuff coming up, and that is the end of that. So if you've made 35 minutes, which by the way is longer than the album, then congratulations. And what I will recommend is, if you are a hardcore The fan, do go to the.com and order the official bootlegs, which are lots of bonus tracks, rare performances, alternate mixes, and obscure material from the darkest depths of the band's body of work. These are really, really interesting pieces to listen to, the official bootlegs. Certainly, Hanky Panky is not the best place to start if you're going to start with Other. If you're going to start with Other, I'd suggest start with Infected or Mind Bomb, or probably best of all, the Comeback Special. But I'll get to that in a few episodes' time. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and each other. As the late, great Jerry Springer said, stay beautiful, and I will see you all soon. All right, bye.